Thank you for joining us for this important conversation about the Vietnam War from a Vietnamese perspective. My name is Johnny Nan. I am a professor of criminology and criminal justice and associate dean of graduate studies at TCU. I am also a Chinese/Vietnamese American, having come to the US as a post-Vietnam War refugee in 1979. Besides my experience growing up in Los Angeles, I have also studied and presented on the migration of Asian American patterns in Southern California, looking not only at geographical movements, but also at generational upward social mobility. This event complements two other events we had held this past academic year about the anti-war movement on TCU's campus in 1971 and the experiences of TCU affiliated servicemen in Vietnam. Those perspectives are important when thinking about the war, but any conversation about it should include the experiences of Vietnamese people, both past and present. Americans know the Vietnam War as lasting between 1955 and 1975 and being the subject of huge political turmoil at home. We also know about the deaths of 58,000 Americans with thousands more injured. For the Vietnamese people, the war represents a longer struggle that began with conflicts against the French and cost millions of Vietnamese lives and the devastation of Vietnam itself, its land, its economy, and its industry. Today, you will see interviews with two outstanding alum of TCU who will provide their own unique perspectives on how the conflict was viewed at the time and is seen today by at least one Vietnamese young adult. Tran graduated from TCU in 2020 with bachelor's degrees in English language and literature and history. She won the American Historical Association's Raymond J. Cunningham Prize in 2021, awarded for the best journal article written by an undergraduate student. Anne's prize-winning submission, A Bloody Solidarity, Nguyen Thai Binh, and the Vietnamese Antiwar Movement in the Long Sixties, was described by my colleague, Kara Vuic, as a, quote, page turner and an important piece of scholarship, unquote. Anne is currently a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Southern California, studying American Studies and Ethnicity. She joins us from Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us. Let's go ahead and dive into your research, if you don't mind.
Oh, of course.
Okay,
it's
for
nice
those
to also be here. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for being here. Let's start with this first question about your research. For those of you who don't know, who was Nguyen Tai Binh and what did he become known for?
Okay, so just like a little bit of background about this research project that I did when I was at TCU. Nguyen Tai Binh was an exchange student, actually, from South Vietnam, who came to the United States in the early 1970s, I believe in 1972. So he had gotten a scholarship from the USAID, which is the United States Agency for International Development, and he was going to study in the United States, learn about the practices, the economic customs, and then come back and contribute to the society. So this is during kind of President Nguyen Quang Thill's term, and the war was going on, and there was a lot happening in the background of kind of his scholarly educational progress. So he goes to the United States, first to Fresno, California, and then eventually he decides to study fisheries and forestry at the University of Washington in Seattle. So Nguyen Tai Binh was, like many other Vietnamese exchange students at the time, was kind of like just going to the United States, or he was there just to study. And this eventually changed when he had a lot of exposure to anti-war movements happening on campuses at the time, and being able to learn about what the US was doing to Vietnam as a student in the United States. So that kind of changed his perspective, and also a lot of the other students in the US. And they would go on to do a lot of anti-war protests amongst themselves in a way that hasn't really been documented by, I think, Asian American historians who've looked at that time period, because Vietnamese students were such a small number and they weren't really considered to be Asian American at all, just because of the nature of their exchange and how they actually were more Vietnamese than Americans. So he, Nguyen Thai Binh, when I think I might be confusing my dates because I had a lot of dates for this, but one of the most important things that he did was he made a really strong stand against this war, and he eventually lost his scholarship from USAID. And because of that, he was going to be basically deported back to Saigon at that time. And by this point, the Saigon government also knew that he was protesting against the war, and Binh himself knew that he was going to face some consequences. So in 1972, I think he arrived in the late 1960s, not early 1970s, sorry. In 1972, he actually hopped on a plane to go back to Saigon, but tried to divert that plane to go to Hanoi instead. And under what is called now like a plane hijacking, he threatened kind of the captain of that flight to fly him in to Hanoi instead. And this was kind of an act of protest against, bringing more munitions to Saigon, which was happening during that flight. And he wasn't armed. He only had kind of a small knife, but the captain colluded with somebody else on that plane to shoot him on the plane. So he was basically assassinated during the flight. And as soon as they landed in the Saigon airport, his body was thrown out of the plane. So this act of a lot of people say martyrdom was really something that a lot of the Vietnamese students who had their philosophies, ideologies changed when they were in the US, they really rallied behind this and eventually grew into kind of what is called the Union of Vietnamese to remember Binh and also to continue fighting to end the war in Vietnam on their own means and in their own terms in the US. So that's really, it's a long story.
Right, and he became such an anti-war icon from that act and drew a lot of attention.
Right.
Great story. And from what I've read, he just had like some lemons. And he got killed over that. All right. What was the Union of Vietnamese?
Yeah, so the Union of Vietnamese was the group of anti-war activists that emerged after Binh's death. And these were Vietnamese students from both the Northeast, from the West Coast, and they joined together at first to really just remember Binh's efforts and to call out, Captain Jean Bond for the act of murder. But eventually it grew into something bigger, and they began publishing newsletters, articles about what was happening in Vietnam, and they really fought for the U.S. to release the 200,000 U.S. prisoners captured under the Thieu regime. And so that was kind of their main purpose after that, was to fight for this. And during this time, there was also quite a large number of exchange students in the US. And I'm still doing research on this, and I think a lot of them were under the USAID program. And they had quite a few newspapers that I'm starting to uncover right now. They're all published in Vietnamese, and they were pro-communist and pro-NLF, National Liberation Front. And these were newspapers that basically talked about how they love their country and they want to kick out the colonizers and the Americans who were destroying it. Eventually, though, the Union of Vietnamese would collapse, at the end of the war when the anti-communist refugees would come over and basically chase out these pro-communist members, and also end kind of their unionizing in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think some of these new immigrants are today, some of the most patriotic,
Yeah.
some of the most patriotic groups in the U.S. That are very pro-American. So let's reflect on back then. In your research, what sort of attitudes and opinions about the Vietnam War did you see reflected in immigrant communities in the U.S. During that time of war?
Yeah, so kind of like I've mentioned, it's so different from what we think of now because there's so little research done on that immigrant community at the time. And I wouldn't say they were immigrants because they were mostly exchange students who then decided to stay and not go back, even though they were supposed to. Or they were kind of some of the early arrivals that had been with like military personnel. So they're like small pockets of different immigrant groups. But the ones that were most visible in my research were the students that had their minds kind of shaped by the anti-war protests happening in the US. And this particular group, they were actually quite vocal. The ones who chose to protest were quite vocal about it. And they had kind of big meetings to talk about what they would do, how they would go to the US consulate or the Republic of Vietnam, or they would write books about it. They were quite out there, but I don't think they were really recognized by anti-protest streams at the time, simply because they spoke in Vietnamese and wrote in Vietnamese. So a lot of this data or documentation is hidden, to be honest, right now. And when historians look at that time period now, they're like, oh, the Vietnamese were not even there. And if they were just like one or two people who came with military husbands. But now, of course, like the more I look into it, the more I find out that there were actually a lot of pro-North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese students in the US who really just hated what the US was doing. And eventually they would, die out, and because of the refugee community and how patriotic they are. But it seems like when we think about that time period before the refugees were here, there was actually a voice that did not agree with US actions. So
yeah, that's really interesting. So even with their limited influence, how did the Vietnamese community in the U.S. influence the anti-war movement?
I think a lot of times they participated in the protests that were happening. So Binh himself was kind of an active anti-war protester, and he would join the ones happening at Berkeley, and he would write articles and columns for newspapers, U.S. newspapers, about the anti-war movement. But what they usually did was more on the fighting to get the Thieu regime to collapse. Whereas I feel like a lot of the anti-war protesters, U.S. anti-war protesters, were focused more so on ending the U.S. Invasion, like totally. So they had different goals. And so sometimes those goals did not really combine their efforts very well. But the ones who did, like I think about scholar Nguyen Long, he was one of the very active anti-war protesters at the time. He still writes about, the Vietnam War, and how the U.S. invasion at the time was seen kind of like a very unnecessary evil and needed to be cut off. And part of that reason was the South Vietnamese government and how terrible and cruel they were to the people of South Vietnam. And so it was very targeted towards the South Vietnamese regime. But I also believe that at that time, a lot of these students also were in contact with members of the Black Panther. They talked a lot with the anti-war veterans as well. If I remember from like a lot of my documents, I would see this happening. But I don't know about the frequency of these interactions and whether or not there were like major get-togethers, meetings where, you know, different protests took place from those meetings. So what I could gather was that there were interactions, and it seems like the Vietnamese students were more influenced by outside sources.
Wow, that's really interesting. Anything surprise you while you were doing your thesis?
Actually, a lot of things surprised me. I didn't know any of this history, simply because I come from an immigrant refugee family. And so all my life I thought, oh, you know, the ones in the US are like super anti-communist. They're like pro-Trump. They hate the North Vietnamese. And then the ones in Vietnam love, you know, don't know anything, or they love the government. And that's what at least my parents have told me. So reading about this information and hearing that Nguyen Thai Binh is kind of this anti-war icon at the time was enlightening to me, to say the least. Now I think his name and kind of his image has been co-opted into the communist government's or the Vietnamese government's message about the war. They've named several streets after him. He was designated like hero of the armed forces. And I think the US wasn't really proud of what this guy did. And so his name faded, right? But the Vietnamese government, the Republic of Vietnam, also tried to like erase his name. But then when the war ended, the North Vietnamese were like, we wanted to preserve what this guy means, what he did for us, and how he is a symbol of anti-US action. And I thought that was interesting also, just simply because his message, I don't think was so much, I am pro North Vietnamese, but more, I just want to end the US colonization or invasion of Vietnam, and I want my country to be healthy and not be destroyed by US action. So I think depending on what sources you look at, there's like several different messages you can get from what he did. And I think that's fascinating just because the message is so different from where you read it.
Yeah, even from our conversation, I find it interesting how there's different narratives and different lenses to look at somebody who was either labeled a anti-war hero or a terrorist at the time. So it's kind of interesting to see that. What do you think Americans need to understand about the views of Vietnamese people had and still may have about the war?
Yeah, I think Vietnamese people is a really broad category just because there is such a big population now, and different generations hold different views as well. I think many of the older generations still hold on to, at least the ones in the US, still hold on to this perception that the communist government is evil and the US saved us. Therefore, we should be patriotic to this country and preserve the memory of South Vietnam, the yellow flag with the red stripes. And being in Los Angeles and so close to Orange County, like I still see all of that preserved in like memorials of Little Saigon, and kind of trying to memorialize both the American soldier alongside the South Vietnamese soldier, right? And so that's one way of looking at it. There's still a lot of that in existence. People still hold on to those views, especially older generation. But I think that a lot of kids my age, and maybe a little bit older as well, are starting to recognize that the US war in Vietnam was not an act of protection, or even an act of trying to save Southeast Asia from the invasion of communism, but it was rather just like totally, unnecessary, uncalled for, and just a way of demonstrating brute force and power. So a lot of people, I think my age, would agree with that, especially if you read a lot of the books nowadays. They kind of fight against the patriotic messages that the refugee community has. And then there's also kind of the point of view that our parents and grandparents experience different things from the young people, and so the way they feel is to some extent something that we can never understand. And so that's something I'm hearing more about and coming around to understanding, or being more open to it, because as I'm getting older, I'm like, I need to understand where my parents are coming from, why they feel certain ways, how people's refugee passages really changed the way they thought about the government and how they view the US when these helicopters and ships rescued them. So I think there's a lot to know about the Vietnamese people. They were not a monolithic group, and people hold different feelings, emotions. Sometimes they're super patriotic, sometimes they hate the US government. So it's really varied. And with my research, I'm really hoping to shed some light on like another perspective that existed, so that we aren't grouped into this kind of homogenous opinion about the US, that there's a lot of variances. So yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing your research with us. I think what's fascinating to me is seeing how the research shapes you and your cultural identity, and being able to reflect on yourself and your family and just everything, especially living in Southern California right now, which is such a, you see it play out even after so many decades, that it's still active. But just fascinating research, and good luck to you as you're pursuing your is it your master's degree right now at UCLA?
Ph.D.
Oh, your PhD. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So you
No
got
worries.
your master's degree here. So yeah, good luck to you in the future. And I look forward to reading some more of your research.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I keep finding new newspapers. I need to train to read in Vietnamese, train better, so I can actually be able to use different sources that are not just English-based. And hopefully that produces new findings and discoveries that are fruitful.
Tao Pham graduated from TCU with a BS in Strategic Communication in 2019 and a master's in the same subject in 2020. Tao is a native of Hanoi, Vietnam's capital. She works for Swinburne University of Technology's Vietnam campus as a public relations officer. Tao, thank you for joining us today. I think all the way from Hanoi, is that right?
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Nguyen, for having me today.
It's my pleasure.
Nice to meet you again.
Yeah, nice seeing you again. Let's just go ahead and jump right into it. First question for you is, for the viewers who might not know you, can you introduce yourself and talk about how you came to TCU and what are you doing right now?
Okay, so for those who may not know me, my name is Tao. I'm a TCU alum, and I graduated from TCU in 2019 for my bachelor. And because I loved it too much, I stayed for another year to get my master degree in both in strategic communication, and I graduated in 2020. And I have been working in communications and marketing in Hanoi ever since. So my story of coming to TCU is quite random, actually. I never heard about TCU when I was applying, and I just heard that TCU has a very good program in communications, and TCU is actually very generous for Vietnamese students in terms of scholarships and financial aid. So I just applied, and that's the story how I got to TCU.
Oh, great. All right. In North Texas, young people usually don't receive a formal education about the Vietnam War until high school. Do you remember when and how you started learning about the war?
So because I was an international student coming to the US, and so my first encounter to the teaching of the Vietnam War may be a little bit different because
Mhm.
we first learned about it in our elementary school. And so the education system in Vietnam is like this. So you had the first encounter with a subject, or the overview of something in elementary school, and then you relearn it in middle school, and then you relearn it again in high school. And so it's like a process, and like a spiral thing like this. And so you just dig deeper when you get higher in higher education. And so my first encounter with my experience with learning about the Vietnam War in Vietnam was quite different from what I learned in the US history class. And to I think most Vietnamese people, my generations, and maybe even older people, they consider the Vietnam War as a fight against the Americans for freedom, and not like a civil war like the Americans consider it.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm sure that wasn't the first time you heard about the war. Your family, I'm sure, has been talking about it before you actually learned about it in school. Is that right?
Yes, so because my parents are both I don't know if this is appropriate, because the classifications of baby boomers may be a little bit you know inappropriate to apply to a country outside of the US. But then let's just call them baby boomers, to have our listeners feel more related and more relatable. So they are both baby boomers, and so that means that, like, for most of their childhood or early adulthood, they lived through the war.
Mhm.
And yes, so they have it, like they experience this first-handedly, and not
Mhm.
just like from the radios or newspapers or movies, stuff like that. And so yeah, they shared about stories and experience to us children when I was growing up, and even for now, they're still occasionally talking about that.
Mhm. Yeah. Did anything surprise you about your classmates or professors' understanding of the war when you came to TCU?
Mm, I must say, yes, because like when I first came to the US, uh, I can say that I was ignorant about how international friends or my American peers might perceive about Vietnam. Uh, mm, because I grew up and lived in Vietnam for most of my life before I came to the US. So I did not know much about how other people would perceive about Vietnam. And when I first came to the US, and I learned that I thought that Vietnam would be pretty well known to international friends, because we have a lot of international guests and travelers and visitors every year. But then it turns out it was not the case. So most of my American peers in my freshman year, they only knew about Vietnam through the Vietnam War,
Mhm.
and many of them still, thought Vietnam would be like the same place
Mhm.
that they would see in pop culture movies like Apocalypse Now or The Deer Hunter, stuff like that. But then, yeah, a lot has changed ever since.
Yeah, it's a very modern place now, right? I mean, they're
Yeah,
thinking of it as like immediately post-war Vietnam War, Vietnam, but things have changed a lot since.
yes, absolutely.
Um, yeah, has the Vietnam War come up with in discussion with your friends and family, and how was it discussed? Just kind of following up on what we
So
talked about earlier.
yeah, so like I said before, it came up in my parents' stories. But then just to emphasize about this, so I mean, like the experience may not be pleasant,
Mhm.
obviously, but then this came up, as I don't think that like to show any resentment, but then
Mhm.
just to recall about like a difficult times, and then like how they would, you know, persevere through it. And so like what stood out for me was my father's story. When he was in his 7th grade, a bomb hit his classroom, and so 12 of his classmates and also his teacher was killed in that, and that stood out for him, like I think for the rest of his life. And also my uncle was killed in action somewhere in middle Vietnam in 1973 or something like that, and we never found him. So that is something that still stayed with my dad for the whole time. And for my mom, the experience may be a little bit less severe. She is actually from Hanoi, so if you're familiar with the series of the events in the Vietnam War, then she was in Hanoi right before the Paris Peace Accord was, was signed. And so, yeah, basically she was there during the heaviest bombing time of Northern Vietnam. And she was only around 10, but then she still remembered, looking at the windows and seeing the movements and stuff like that, and hearing the siren out in the streets. But then, yeah, I mean, stories like that came up, occasionally, but then not to show any resentment. It's just like to recall back like a time when things were so different from now. And it came up again, with the event of the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine and stuff like that.
And then they start talking about and relating that back to Vietnam. Yeah, I find it interesting that they don't have any type of like hard feelings and resentment, right? I mean, especially since it was like a civil war, but there's none of that lingering today.
Well, I mean, I think it is safe for me to say that like well, because my parents sent me to the US for college anyway, so they may not like have that the strong sentiments towards the US. But then I think it is safe to say that most Vietnamese people, from what I see, they do not forget, but they forgive. Not like forgive about, they actually like they moved on from the pains and the wounds from the war, and they just all, I feel like they all just want to have like a peaceful and collaborative relationship with the US and other countries, and then just like lingering to what happened in the past. And I think that is like the safest things to say.
Yeah,
but then it may be a little bit different from people to people. I don't know.
Yeah. Do you see a lot of American tourists over there?
Actually, in Hanoi, we have more European tourists.
Oh, okay.
But then, Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City has more American tourists, revisiting the memories there.
Yeah. From your experience as a Vietnamese citizen and TCU alum, what do Americans need to understand about the views Vietnamese people had and still have about the war?
So it kind of, follows up with what I just said, what I just shared. Like Vietnamese people, they do not linger to the past in that sense, but then they really, want to look forward and, just to have peace and collaborative relationships with other countries. But then also, I think something that stood out to me, I mean, like, at least for my younger generation, I don't know if this is due to the propaganda and the history lessons that we got from school, but then for most Vietnamese people, at least my age, we thought about the Vietnam War as a fight for freedom and not like a fight for the communist ideas. Like that. I mean, at least that was the perception I got from my US history lessons.
Right.
In TCU. Then it was and that was something that surprised me, because it is very different from what we learned in class in Vietnam compared to what we got in history class in the US. But then it's interesting for me to find out.
Yeah, there's actually were you surprised at the Vietnamese population in North Texas when you were here?
Yes, very much. But then I was glad because I got to eat some good Vietnamese food.
Oh, you get to eat some of the food. How does the food compare?
Well, I mean, the food, well, if I think that you already know this, but then the Vietnamese population in North Texas are mostly people from the South. And so,
Yeah.
you have Southern and Middle Vietnam's food other than, more than Northern Vietnam food. But then I think the food is very good. It's better than what I got in Hanoi actually for Southern Vietnamese food.
Oh, wow. Wow. I guess
Yeah.
we are fortunate to have that. Well,
Yes.
I think that's all the questions that we have. I wanted to thank you for taking the time, especially, being so far away and during your day to speak with us. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I think this is a very meaningful conversation and opportunity for me to speak with my peers and meet with my TCU friends again.
Yeah, come back for a PhD.
Yes, maybe soon.
Oh, okay, maybe okay. We'll make that happen. All right, thank you.
Okay.